And as Corrine said, my name is John Carlson. I'm the Director of Training here at RAN 3D. And so I'm responsible for the people that go through and deliver the training classes for our company. And I'm a longtime CAD user. I've spent most of my adult life training people in some type of CAD system, one or another. So really for the last 30 years, that's what I've done. And then for the last 18 years, I've gone through and worked on CATIA V5. Now, today's topic is we're going to go through and talk about multi-section features in CATIA. Now, we labeled it CATIA V5 and the 3DEXPERIENCE because this feature is the same in both of those softwares. The only difference you would notice is the dialog box is a different color, but all the options are the same. The results are all going to be the same. So you can either be in V5 or the 3DEXPERIENCE. It's going to be the same when you come to building a multi-section. Now, the pictures, most of the pictures are from a V5 training manual, but when I give the demonstration, I'll actually use the 3DEXPERIENCE and show you how it's done there with that. Now, with the multi-section feature, we want to go through and kind of just talk about, what it is here real quick and go over the various options. Now, it is one of the fundamental ways of creating something in CATIA, but it's got a lot of options that go with it. And most of the options you never use, but it makes it very confusing. How does it work exactly? Should I be using this? Should I not be using that? So we want to talk about the basics first, and then we're going to come back and talk about all the options that would go along with this as well. Now, for the basics, it's actually pretty straightforward. All you really need to go through and do to make a multi-section is you just have to go through and have sections that you want to go through and blend together on here. So in this first example over here on the left, they're just going to go from a rectangle section here to a rectangle section here to another rectangle section over here. It's not going to go through and just blend those three sections together to create the geometry on here. And then over here on the right, again, they just got a couple of sketches over here. They got kind of a sketch here that they're going to blend to a sketch back over here to go through and create the shape that you see. So you got to have at least two sections when you make a multi-section, but you can have as many additional ones as you want. Now with the multi-section, you can go through and create this both as a solid and as a surface. The example on the left is a solid example. The surface over here on the right is a surface on here. So if you were in your part design workbench or your part mode app, you would go through and find two multi-section choices. You'd get a multi-section solid, which would add material, and you would get a remove multi-section solid. That would let you go through and subtract. Now, if you wanted to go through and create it as a surface, you would need to go into your generative shape design workbench or app, and then you would go through and find the multi-section surface option that you could go through and use. But the choices are pretty much the same. There's only really one difference between the two, and we'll discuss that as we go along. Now, with the multi-section basics, you just need to go through and create those sections and then just select them in the order that you want to go through and connect them together. And if you're going to go through and create a solid, you have to have a closed section. So again, I've got a closed rectangle here to go through and define section number 1. And it also has to go through and be planar. If it doesn't meet that requirement, you can't go through and use it as a section to build a solid. Now, if you're going to go through and make a multi-section surface, then you don't have those same restrictions. You can have an open sketch like you see here. This is obviously not a closed shape. And then it doesn't have to be planar. Now, these are probably planar sketches, but if this was some type of non-planar projection, you could still go through and use it to define one of the sections if it's a surface. Now, the dialog box, this is the dialog box that will come up. And again, there's kind of two things that are required in order to go through and make a multi-section. One is you first have to come up here and define those sections. And when you define them, you want to pick them in order you want them connected together. I want to connect number 1 to 2, over here to 3 as I go along. And then the other thing you'll need to pay attention to is you'll need to come down below here to coupling, and you'll have to make sure that you've got the right coupling method turned on. But those are really the only two things you have to do to create a multi-section. But you can see you got a lot of other choices here. I got guides, I got spline, I got relimitation, I got area law. So we're going to also go through and talk about all those choices there as well. Now, also, anytime that you go through and define one of the sections, you're going to have to go through and pay attention to what they go through and call the closing point on here. So when you pick section number 1 here, this rectangle, it's a little bit tough to see in the slide, but a little arrow actually comes up down here in the corner. This is the closing point down here. Now, when I go to pick section number 2, it doesn't really matter where your closing point is but you want to be consistent. So I've got the closing point down here in the corner. Same thing with section number 3. I got the closing point over here. So the computer is going to connect closing point to closing point when it goes through and makes the feature. So if my closing points were mismatched, I had one here maybe at the top, I had one over here, and then one over here, I would go through and get a twist as it went through and created the feature on there. So you do have to kind of pay attention to them. So the closing points must be in a consistent location, and they also must point in the same direction rotationally. There will be an arrow that will come up with this. Now this arrow could either point to the right, it could point to the left, it could point up, or it could go through and point down on here. And you're really thinking about a rotational direction. If my arrow was pointing, let's say, to the down or to the right, I am basically going around this rectangle then counterclockwise on here. If my arrow was to go through and point up or point to the left, I'm then going through and basically going around that circle or rectangle clockwise on here. And I need to be consistent. So again, when I'm over here on this last section, I need to make sure that this arrow points in a direction, again, that's going to go through and match on here. Otherwise, again, you'd get twisted around on there. So those are kind of the two things you need to pay attention to when you select the section. Where is my closing point? And then you might have to potentially move it, and you may also have to flip the arrow. Now, if you're building a surface where you've got an open section, all you have to do is make sure that the arrows point in the same direction. This arrow points to the left, this arrow here over here, and this section also points to the left. I'm fine on there. Now, if the closing point doesn't come up in the spot where you want it to be, you can go through and move it. What you can do is you can kind of move your cursor where it says closing point here, and if you were to hold your right mouse button down, there would be a choice called replace. And when you choose replace, it would now let you select a new location. Hey, I want to move the closing point from this corner here up to this corner here. And then would then shift it into the new position. And then also, if your arrow should be pointing the wrong way, it's pointing to the right, and I really want this to point, let's say, to the left for some reason, all you have to do is pick on the arrow, and that would flip it the other way on there. And again, if you have to, you can always come back here later and change the closing point. If you forget to move it right away, you can change it at any time. And then the coupling method on here. This gets a little bit confusing. There's 4 different coupling methods that you can go through and choose from, and they don't use the best names for them, but you're going to be able to choose from ratio, tangency, then curvature, and vertices. And what the coupling basically defines is how are the sections connected together. What point on section number 1 gets connected to what point on section number 2 gets connected to one point on section number 3. That is controlled here by the coupling method on here. So I've got some examples that I want to go through and look at here to go over it. Now, in this first example on the left, they're just going to go through and make a multi-section from a rectangle. That's their first section. And they're going to go to an oval shape over here as their second section on here. And then over here on the right, again, they're going to make a multi-section surface. And they just got a piece here that's a straight line. There's an arc right here. There's another arc here. There's another straight line. Now, these 2 arcs right here, though, have a tangent connection. And that's also true back here. They got a line, they got an arc, they got another line here, they got a tangent connection right here, and then they got another line sticking out. Because these coupling methods are going to be based upon is the item tangent or not on how it behaves. Now, one way that you can do it is by ratio. And this is a very common method because it will pretty much work with anything on here. And with ratio, what will happen is I'll talk about the example over here on the right first, is it's just going to connect the first start point here over to this end point over here. So start gets connected to start, end point gets connected over here to end point. And then what it does is it works its way across here when it's going through and building the geometry, it just goes through and bases it on a ratio. So when I'm 10% along this first curve, it finds the 10% point on the second curve and it connects them together. When it's halfway down this first curve, it just goes through and finds the halfway point on the second curve to connect. And so you would get this result that you see here down below if you turned on ratio. Now what will happen is it starts to find the percent and starts to connect across. When it gets to this one corner right here, this is where the line comes together with the arc. So what it does is it then's going to internally break the surface. So let's say this is like 15% along here. The computer's then going to go through and connect to the 15% point over here. It's now going to start to continue along further. Again, it runs into this next break. So again, it's now going to go through and divide this piece up and then find the corresponding percent point over here. Same thing's going to happen when it gets into this break right here. It's going to go through and kind of go across. So it goes through and creates the shape just basically based on percent distance to connect them together. Now, this may not be exactly what you want. So you may want to use some of the other coupling methods we'll discuss in a second. Now, over here in this one on the right, same thing's happening. Now, this closing point again is getting connected to the closing point. And then it just starts to work its way around proportionally. You know, it gets to the end of this particular item here, whatever that distance is around on the oval, it finds the corresponding percent point over here on the rectangle section. But you'll notice here, it doesn't connect right to the corner. Part of this arc here is actually getting blended to part of the straight piece over here. So with ratio turned on, it's just percent distance along. It'll create the shape, but it might have a bunch of small pieces created internally. Now, another option that you could go through and use is you could potentially go through and use vertices. Now, I can use vertices on these examples because they have the same number of corner points. You know, I've got a rectangle here that's got 4 corner points. I got an oval back here, again, that's got 4 corner points. And basically what happens is the computer connects corner point to corner point when it goes through now and makes the multi-section on here. So this gives me a nice, you know, straight line goes to arc, straight line goes to straight line connection all the way around. Now again, over here on the right, notice again, it goes through and finds the vertices. So again, it matches the endpoints, but it then finds this break point, matches it to that break point. This break point goes to there, and then this break point goes to there. Now for this to work though, there has to be the same number of vertices. If there's not, this would not work on here. And then you also have a couple other ones, tangency, and tangency then curvature. And these are the ones that are confusing because the names are a little bit misleading here. Now, when you're going through and doing a tangency coupling, it is going to go through and create the coupling curves based upon the location of tangency discontinuity. From the term, you'd think, hey, it's looking for tangent connections to match to each other. What it's actually looking for is non-tangent connections to match to each other. So in this example on the right again, you know, I got a non-tangent connection here. So that matches to this non-tangent connection over here. I got a non-tangent connection here, and that matches over to here. Now, it doesn't care about this tangent connection right here. So notice this tangent connection here does not connect to that one over there. It just is based on percent then in between. So these two corners do not get directly connected with tangency turned on. Now over here on the left, it wouldn't work at all. And it wouldn't work because I don't have the same number of non-tangent connections. I've got 4 non-tangent connections over here, and I don't have any non-tangent connections on the backside. So it would come back and kind of preview this result that you see down below and then give you this error message. You know, it tells me the current coupling mode cannot be applied. And then that tells me to switch into another one. So when you've got tangency turned on, it's trying to match non-tangent connection to non-tangent connection. Now, if you've got tangency then curvature turned on, if we look on the example on the right, notice the non-tangent corners still get connected together. So it's still looking for that discontinuity, but then it's also going to match the tangent connections. So this tangent connection here in the first curve is going to get matched to that tangent connection there. And so this would now give me, you know, those corners would connect to each other as you see. So I would get a different result between tangent and then tangency with curvature with that example. And then again, the example over here on the left, it wouldn't work at all. And again, because I just don't have the same number of non-tangent connections for the computer to join up. It's a little bit misleading when they say tangency and then tangency and curvature. It really is trying to go through and find discontinuity with tangency, and then it's also trying to find tangency when you've got curvature part turned on. So make sure you're in the right coupling mode. And that's one of the biggest things you need to think about anytime you're making a multi-section. Now, it is possible to also come back and add manual coupling curves. So in this example that you see here, notice under coupling, they've got this set to ratio. But then down below, they've got what they call some coupling curves here. Now, this lets me go through and kind of further refine the shape. Now, here they're going to go from a square to a hexagon. So again, the only real coupling method that would work would be ratio. And so again, the closing point here would get connected to the closing point here, and it would just start to work its way around based on percent distance on here. You know, whatever percent distance here in the rectangle, it would find that corresponding point up here on the hexagon. But you'll notice they've got some of these sides here kind of created here as triangles. What they're doing is they're adding coupling curves. Is they're telling the computer, hey, I need to have this one corner right here connected to this corner right here. I need to have this corner here again connected over to here. So I'm kind of forcing the computer to connect certain corners together by adding these manual coupling curves over here on the right. So it is actually fairly common that you would go through and do that. But that lets me then go from a four-sided figure to a hexagon and not just use ratio where percent blends distance around. I'll give you a couple examples where you can go through and use coupling curves to help you get a better shape. Anytime that the computer is going through and creating really narrow little pieces, like here, back here, it's creating this little kind of narrow strip of surface, you'd really like to get rid of that. It'll give you a more stable result. So again, I could actually come back here with this option, and by adding a coupling curve from this point right here to this point over here, I could then switch it to get this result right here. So you can add these coupling curves basically to help refine the shape once you've got it started. That's one of the trickiest parts about making a multi-section. And then also the other options now. I got supports, I got guides, I got spine, I got relimitation, I got area law. These are all optional. You don't have to do anything with these to make it work if you don't want to. But we're going to come back and talk about each of these and what effects they'll have. Now, the first thing we talk about is the idea of adding a support. When you go through and define these sections, so in this example, there's two kind of sections here. Section number one here is the sketch. Section number two is there's a sketch back here with this. And by default, over here on the left, if you didn't go through and add any type of support, this is what you would get. So the computer really just goes through kind of in a straight line when it goes through and does the blending action between those shapes. Now, on this second section over here at this kind of circle end, they came back and added a support, and their support is this cylinder. So now what it's going to do is it's going to go through and make a tangent to that. So when you add a support, you can say, hey, blend in smoothly. So notice how it changes the shape slightly. So this actually comes out tangent and then starts to curve down as it creates the shape, rather than just going a direct straight line between those sections. So it's pretty subtle in this example, but it lets you kind of force the section then to blend into the surrounding geometry smoothly when you create it. So this is actually pretty common that you would do it, especially if you're doing a multi-section surface. And then guide curves. Guide curves, again, are optional. You don't have to have guide curves, but it does let you further control the shape. Now, in this example, they've got two sections here, so just kind of two half circles, and they got one guide curve. Now, you can have as many guide curves as you want on here, but they only got one. Now, if I didn't have the guide curve, when it went through and made the multi-section again, it would just go in a straight line between those two sections. But by coming back and adding this one curve as a guide, that forces the shape now to go through and follow that as it goes along on here. So basically, it just defines a path for that to follow as it goes through and creates the feature. Now, for your guide curve to be valid, though, this guide curve must intersect the sections. So this guide curve could not be off to the side. If it doesn't intersect each of the sections, it'll come back and warn you it doesn't intersect, and it won't work on there. Now, if you wanted to further control the side, hey, maybe I want to have some other shape over here on the side, I could potentially have another guide curve over here that would go through and control the side of the shape if I wanted to as well. So you can have just one guide curve, but you can have as many additional ones as you want. Gives you better control then on what you're going to create. And then the spine. The spine controls kind of the internal calculations of the computer. So in this example that you see here, they've got two sketches. They got, section number one here, again, that half circle sketch. They've got kind of this second section over here, another half circle, but they're off at an angle to each other. So if I was to look down at the top, here's section number one right here, and here's section number two off at an angle. So what the computer does is when it comes up with these intermediate sections here, kind of the calculations in between, is it goes through and just kind of slowly changes this to always go through and kind of switch the angle as it goes along on here. Now, you may want that to happen, but what if I just want to blend those two sections together just straight? I don't want to follow that kind of curve shape. Well, what I could do then is I could come down here under the spine tab, and I could replace the computed spine. That's where the computer comes up with it on its own, and I could actually pick something. Your spine can either be an edge, it could be a sketch, it could be a curve. So I've got this straight line right here. I'm using that sketch right there now as my spine. So now notice when it makes the intermediate cross sections, these intermediate cross sections have to be created perpendicular then to that spine, which is the straight line on here. So it does influence the shape quite a bit in that case. Now the spine curve, you can only have one spine, and it does not have to intersect the sections. The spine curve is way over here to the side. If you're going to make a guide curve, then again, the guide curves have to intersect the actual sections. Now the spines in the guides, they can be used together, but typically it's either one or the other. Because remember, the spine is telling it what you have to be normal to when it goes through and makes the internal calculations. And if I was to have some type of guide curve out here that tries to make some type of certain shape, that may conflict with that. And so these things can actually be used together. But in most cases, if you have one turned on, it's impossible to get the other one to work on here. So I always suggest just one or the other. Don't try and add a spine and guide curves together into the same feature. And then relimitation. Now, this is an option, and it only makes a difference if you have a spine or you have a guide curve. And the spine and the guide curve has to be longer than the sections. So again, they got these same two sections that we've been discussing here, but now we've got, again, this guide curve right here, and this guide curve is really way longer than the two sections. Now, by default, it'll be relimited on the start. It will be relimited at the end on here. Now notice section number 1 was actually over here at the far end, and then section number 2 is over here. So if you were to turn off the relimited, what would happen is this would just continue then this thing out to the length of that guide curve on there. Now if that guide curve was even longer, it would extend this thing out even longer on here. So it then goes through and kind of uses either the spine or the guide curve to determine the overall length of the multi-section. Now, what will happen is this last defined section right here, it will continue that last defined section out. So it's not actually going through and extrapolating. It's just keeping this piece right here then, whatever that original last section was when it creates the geometry. Now, again, if this guide curve was longer at the other end, it extended past over here, then again, I could turn off the relimitation at that end as well. But again, you got to have a guide curve, or you got to have a spine that's longer than the actual sections you're trying to blend together. And then the area law. Now with the area law, it lets you go through and actually control the area between the sections. Now in this example, again, they got kind of a square section here, so that's section number 1. They got a circle section over here, that's section number 2. Now again, if you just to make a regular multi-section between, it would just go in a straight line. And would slowly get bigger and taper up as it went along. So what they've done here in this example is they've gone through and they made a law over here. Now this law, this is a feature that you can go through and create, and you would have to be in the generative shape design app or workbench to create it. You could not create this in the part design workbench, but this goes through and defines the area and how I want it to change on here. Now when you make a law, the law consists of 2 sketches in this case. There's a straight line sketch down below here, and this just defines or represents the length of this multi-section. Where this first point is right here, that's where the multi-section begins. When I'm all the way over here to the other end of this curve, that's where the multi-section ends. When I'm halfway down this line, I am halfway down my multi-section on here. So that straight line just kind of defines the percent distance along. Now, I've dimensioned this as 5, but this distance between these sections might not be 5, it's some percentage. Now, this line does have to be sketched when you do it in the sketcher along the horizontal direction of your sketcher on here. And then the other sketch is this kind of orange line on here. Now, this is the actual line that's controlling the size of the item on here. So it's this dimensioned as 1 here at that end, and it's dimensioned over here 2 at this end. And so that's going to be the size at the beginning. Now, one thing to keep in mind, though, when you're doing an area law is it's based on the radius of a circle. So when you see the value 1 here, that doesn't mean I have 1 square unit here. That means the radius is 1. So remember, the area of a circle is pi r squared. So again, r squared, this means it's going to be 3.14. So I actually have an area 3.14 at this end. Now the other end, again, it's 2. So again, 2 squared is 4 times 3.14. You would actually have an area over here about 12.56 when you went through and did this. So you got to do a little bit of math in your head to go through and do this. But you can see here, for the first 2.5 units, which is halfway down, it's going to go through and keep the area here at 3.14. And then it's going to let it slowly grow up to the largest size, which will be the 12.56 over here. So you have to go through and create this law, and then you go through and use this law then to drive how the area will change the sections as it goes along. This is probably a little tricky when you start to get into the math, trying to figure out what the exact size should be on these dimensions when you're creating it. And again, I'll give you an example of this here in just a second. And then the last option. Now, this last option, it's only available with surfaces. If you're building a multi-section solid, it's not a choice. But if you're building a surface, there's going to go through and be this choice here for the canonical element on here. Now, if this is check marked on here, here they're going from kind of a rectangle to another rectangle. This face here is actually flat on here. If this is check marked and this face is flat, the computer will treat this as a plane that you can go through and sketch on. Now, if this is not turned on, though, even though this is flat, the computer would not let you go through and put a sketch on here when you were done. So that's really what that does. It just really kind of turns these flat faces into planes that then CATIA will recognize that you can create sketches upon. But again, it's only for surfaces. It doesn't apply for solids. So that's where it gets a little bit confusing. You've got all of these different options that go along when making the multi-section. Now, you'll probably never use all of them at once, but they do have a pretty big effect on the results you're going to get. So let's take a look at a couple examples here. So I want to go back here again, and I got the 3D experience already running here. And let's just do a really simple example here. I just want to go through and make a multi-section from these 2 sketches that I've already created. So again, it's just really a rectangle sketch. And again, it's, kind of 3 lines and an arc here at the other end. Now again, I'm currently in the part workbench. So again, I got the multi-section here. So there's the multi-section solid and there's a remove as well. I'm going to do the multi-section solid here. And then with that, I'll make this dialog box hopefully just a little bit bigger here so we can see it. Now it's looking for me to pick the sections. And I'm just going to pick on this section here, the rectangle first. And it's a little bit tough to see, but the closing point is actually down here in this lower left corner. And the arrow is pointing to the right down here. Now, let's say I want to go through and move that. Okay, it's in the wrong spot. I would just right click on the closing point and then say I want to replace it. And all you got to do is now pick the new corner. Well, I really want it to be down here in that corner right there. Again, if the arrow is pointing the wrong way, just pick on the arrow. It'll flip it the other way on there. So now I've gone through and moved my closing point. I got my arrow pointing the right way. Now I want to come back and add my second section. Now, if you go through and mess around and move the closing point, you just can't come over here and pick now the second section. You have to come back over here into the section area, re-highlight this area, and then come over here and say add. I'm going to add another section in on here. Now, if you don't have to move the closing point and you just keep picking, you can pick as many as you want without having to come back here and say add. But now when I pick on this second section here again, closing point comes up. Of course, it's in the wrong corner now. So I'm going to right click here again. I'm going to replace that as well. I'm going to move it to this corner here. And again, this is where the arrow now is pointing the wrong way. So I'm going to go through and flip this back So it points that way. Okay, so I got my two sections defined. And now what I want to do is I want to come over and check my coupling method. Now it's currently set to tangency, then curvature. Remember, this is the one that's going to go through and try and match the same number of non-tangent connections. Now I really don't have that here. So if I was to come over and just try and preview, notice that's where it comes back and says the current coupling mode cannot be applied on here. Okay, so that one's not going to work. Now ratio would work if I was to come over and say ratio and preview that. That's where it just works its way around. So notice again, coupling point gets connected to coupling point, starts to work its way around. But notice how this one division here on this back side doesn't get connected right to this corner here on the front side. So it is going to go through and create the shape, but it may also do some little twisting here as well. Okay, so I really don't like that result with the ratio. Now, to get rid of that twisting, probably the easiest way to do it, since I have the same number of vertices here in this example, is just switch it to vertices. And now if I come back over here and say preview, notice how I've gone through and gotten rid of that twisting. So corner gets connected to corner all the way around. That would probably be the best choice to use here in this example. And then once I've got that again, that's really all I would need. I could come over here and say, okay, I could go through and complete my multi-section on there. So let's go back here to the ISO view. Now again, if I need to go back and change that, again, I can just double click on it and I can come back here and change all these things later. Now, let's say I wanted to go through and I want to go through and add some type of maybe a spine or a guide curve on here. I got a few things that are hidden here. So I'm going to go through and unhide a few things over here. I'm going to unhide this sketch right here. I'm going to unhide this sketch right here. And then this combine here with that. And the first thing I want to talk about is just the idea of the spine. Now, if I was to come over and look at this thing again straight down here from the top, it's just going through kind of blending in a straight line between, probably what I want. But if I was to come back over here and double click on this, again, I could come over and say spine, and I'm going to turn off the computed spine, and I'm going to pick on this arc that I got out here. Now, when I pick on that arc, and I come back over here and re-preview, notice how it kind of influences that. So now when it goes through and takes the internal cross sections, again, they're being created perpendicular to that arc on there. Probably not what I want, though. So I'm going to, again, go back to computed spine, and I'll go back to what I had. Now, the other thing I do want to do, though, if I go back over here into my ISO view, is I do want to add some guide curves. So if I go back over here under guides, there's an area for adding them in on here. So that's what these other three curves that I turned on, I'm going to use. Now, I'm going to go through and use this one curve right here as a guide. Now, again, if it's going to be a guide curve, it does have to intersect these sections. And if I was to preview that with just that one guide curve, notice how it goes through and changes the shape. It goes through and kind of forces now that shape to go through and follow along that one guide curve. As you can see, it does change both sides. Okay, I want this one side over here on the left to stay straight. So I'm going to go through and use this curve right here as a guide now for that side. And now if I come back and re-preview again, it's going to go straight back. Now, if I was to look at this thing from the side over here, okay, let's take a look at this from maybe the right side view over here. What if I want it to follow maybe this shape right here exactly? Obviously it's close, but it's not following that exactly. I'm going to add this as a third guide curve right there. And now when I preview again, it's going to be forced to follow all three of those as it goes through and blends between those two sections. So this gives you a lot more control on the shape when you come back and add the guide curves on there. Now, once that looks good again, I'm just going to come over here and say okay. And that's going to go through and complete my multi-section on there. Now, another example of the spine, I'm going to come back over here to another model I've got here in the background, is potentially with the spine is, here's the example we kind of looked at in the book. I just got those two sections, but they're all kind of at an angle to each other. So if I was just to come over here and do a really quick multi-section through here, come back to my model tab, multi-section, okay, I just want to go from this section here, and I want to come over here to this section here. Again, if I was just to go through and preview that, it kind of goes at a kind of that arc. Okay, I really want this, I intend this to be straight. So again, I would just come back over here and say spine. I want to use this straight line now as my spine on here. So that would be a better example where you might go through and use a spine. I'm trying to straighten something out because the sections weren't parallel to each other. And then also with this spine, I got one more example, is here I got two sections. Again, I'm just going to make a quick multi-section between. So again, multi-section solid. I just want to go from this rectangle sketch here over to that rectangle sketch there. Now my closing points match up and stuff, so I don't need to mess with that. Now again, for my coupling method, I am going to come over here and turn on vertices since I have the same number of corners. Preview that on here. Oh, I got tangency turned on there by mistake. I really wanted vertices turned on there. Preview that, and that would be my result. But I'm going to come back here and add this one curve here as a spine. Now this curve goes way past these. So once I've added that in as a spine now, this is where I can come over and use my relimitation now. I don't want to be relimited on the start. If I turn that off and re-preview, notice how it goes through and extends this all the way to the end of that spine curve. Again, if I turn it off at the other end and re-preview, it's going to extend it out. So that way I could go through and only have those two sections kind of in the middle and just have the computer then continue this section out to the end on there. That would probably be a better example where you might go through again and use a spine. Okay, next thing we want to go through and look at a little bit is some manual coupling curves. Now I coupled this together, but I went through and did it with the automatic just vertice. You know, what if I have to go through and add some manual coupling curves for some reason? So again, I've got something created back here I want to switch into. But I actually have a couple examples here that I want to go through and do. One is I want to go from this kind of triangle section and I want to go to the square on here. So let's do that example first. So I'm going to come down below here again and just do a multi-section solid. And again, I'm going to come over here and pick section number 1. So it's going to go through and be that triangle. Now again, my closing point, I'm just going to leave it there, that lower left corner. That's fine. Section number 2 is going to be that rectangle. Now my closing point is in the wrong corner. So I'm going to come over here and replace that and move it down to here. And again, as long as my arrows go around kind of counterclockwise, I'm fine. Again, if I come over and check my coupling method, now again, you know, vertices won't work. I don't have the same number of vertices. I don't have the same number of non-tangent connections. I don't have the same number of non-tangent curvature connections. The only one that's really going to work here is ratio. And when I turn on ratio here and preview this, you know, it starts to work its way around. But you can see it goes through again and gives you kind of a twisting result on here. So it works, but not what I want at all. So what I want to do again is I want to come back over here and add some manual coupling curves on here. So I hit that button to turn on my dimensions by mistake, but I'm going to come over here to coupling. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so you can see it better. And I can go down below here and highlight this area. And when I do that, it now lets me pick points I want connected together. Now you do have to go in the order you pick the curves. So I picked this curve first. So I'm going to say I want to make a coupling curve from here over to there. And now if I was to re-preview this along the bottom, this is completely flat on here. So I told it, hey, you got to connect that corner to that corner. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another coupling curve, and I'm going to go from this corner here over to there. Again, re-preview that. You can see how it updates, but again, I still just kind of pushing the twisting around. And I'm going to come over and say, okay, I want to make a coupling curve from that same point here over to that corner right there. And now notice when I re-preview, I've kind of effectively eliminated that one edge out of the front section on there. So that would give me a much better result on there. So once you've got kind of your automatic coupling method turned on, you can further refine this with additional coupling curves. So let's say okay to that. Now on this next example, I want to do the same thing, but this is an example of an open section. I cannot make a multi-section solid out of those two sketches. So I'm going to have to switch into my Surface app. So I'm going to come down here to my Generative Shape Design app. And again, I'm still going to come over and get my multi-section command. And you'll notice the dialog box looks 100% the same on here. But I'm just going to go from section number 1 right here. And again, all I got to make sure is that the arrows point the right way with an open sketch like this over to here. And the arrows do. And again, if I was to look at my coupling methods over here, you know, ratio would obviously work on here, but with ratio turned on, Again, I'm going through and getting all these little kind of narrow pieces here. So, I might not like that result on here. I can't really come over again and turn on vertices because, again, I don't have the same number of vertices here. And then the other ones, again, they're not going to really work either because I don't have the same number of connections. So it really is my only choice right now is ratio on here. But to get rid of these pieces, again, I'm going to come back over here and add some coupling curves. So I'll make this a little bit bigger so we can see them better. And I'm going to say, hey, I want to go from this corner here with that. And I need to make sure I come down here and add that. I didn't get that highlighted. I want to go from that corner there. And let's say I got to have this connected to that corner over there. Get that other point selected there. I may have to zoom in because that arrow is in that corner right there. So I'm going to go through and add a coupling curve going across there. And again, if I go through and re-preview that, that's going to go through and connect, the two straight pieces to each other. Again, I'm going to spin this around just a little bit, do the same thing over here on the other side. I'm going to add another coupling curve. Hey, I want this corner here to get connected to that straight piece over there. I'm having a hard time here picking the second point again. Okay, I think it thinks I'm trying to change this arrow direction here, and I'm not. Right there. And now again, if I was to re-preview that, you can see I've changed the shape on there. And that would be a much better result. So now I've got straight piece going to straight piece on here. Now, again, I may want to eliminate, where this straight piece here that's vertical is going onto the arc. Again, I can just come back and add another coupling curve. I want to go from there over to there. I want to come back over from here over to there. So it gives you a lot of control on kind of the internal blending when you come back over here and add these coupling curves on there. Now, once that looks good, again, I'm just going to come over here and say, okay, to go through and complete that. So that would be an example, again, of building a surface. But you can see all my choices are pretty much the same on there. Now, what if I want to go through and make something tangent? Now, this would most apply to surfacing. So I've got this one multi-section created here, but I'm going to come back over here, and I'm going to go through and use this same sketch. And I just want to come over here and potentially maybe extrude something over here. So I'm going to come back over and just say, okay, I want to go through and extrude that surface out on here. Okay. But you can see these two surfaces obviously come together, but they're not tangent, across the top. And I want to go through and make it like maybe smooth between here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back over here into my multi-section on here. And then this is where it's sketch number 2. That's my second section at that end. I'm going to add a support on here. And so all I got to do is highlight the support area here. And what I can do is I can pick what I want to use as a support. And so I'm going to pick this surface right here. And so now notice it's going to set it as tangent. You can choose. Do you want to come out tangent? Do you want to come out curvature? I'll just leave it at tangent. And now if I go through and re-preview this, notice how when I OK this, it comes out now and kind of comes out smoothly here along the top on there. So and that's available again with both solids and surfaces, but probably more likely that you would go through and do that with some type of surface. And again, if I want to get rid of that, don't want that support again, I could right click over here and say, okay, let's remove the support completely. And now again, if I come back over here and re-preview, and it's going to go in a straight line again between there. And you can do it at both ends. You can add supports as required. And then the last thing I want to show you is that area law on here. So I got one more example back here that I want to get into. And this is what I want to end up creating right here. So it's kind of that example we saw earlier on the slides. I want to go through and make a multi-section that goes from the square to the circle on here. So I'm going to go through and delete what I've already got here. And I'm going to go through and create that multi-section. Now that was a multi-section solid, so I'm going to go back here into my part design app to go through and create that. Now to create it again, I would just come back over here and say, okay, yeah, I want to go through and make a multi-section. I really just want to go from this section here to this section over here. Now my closing points are not in the same corner. So I'm going to right click here and replace that and move it up here. And then I did divide this circle here into 4 arcs. So to make it really simple, I can just come over to a coupling and just switch this into vertices. And if I was to preview this, it would just go in a straight line between. So obviously my area is being determined by the computer on those in-between sections. Okay, I want to go through and control that a little bit better. So this is where I want to go through and make that law to control it. Now, to make the law, I've already got a couple of sketches over here to the side. Again, a law is defined by 2 sketches. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to double click on this sketch right here, get myself back into the sketcher, and then get this turned back around the way it was originally created. And so this is just a straight line. That's one part of my law. But again, notice it's along the horizontal direction here of my sketcher. And so again, where this line starts, that represents kind of the beginning of my shape. That's the square end. And then where it ends over here, that represents the other end, which is the circle end. And this really could be any length because it's based on percent distance. I just made it 5. So that's the first thing I did. I'm going to exit out. Now the second sketch I've got here, again, if I double click on it, this is the actual one that will control the size. Again, get myself turned around into the normal view. And then notice I just got a dimension here, a 1 at the beginning. So that means that I'm representing that as a radius of 1. So my size is going to actually go through and be, 3.14 square units at that end. And then over here at the other end, I've got this dimension as 2. And so that's going to end up being the 12.56 on there with that. And then notice I got the straight line come across, horizontally for the first 2.5 units. So for the first 50%, the area is going to be 3.14. When it gets to the halfway point, then it's going to start to slowly taper up to the 12.56 at the end. So the law is just defined by those 2 sketches. So now I'm going to exit the app. Now, just creating those 2 sketches by themselves doesn't make the law. What you would need to do is go back into the generative shape design workbench to create it. I've already got the law created over here. I'll just double click on the law I've got. But all you need to do to make a law is you just have to pick those 2 sketches. And so it's going to ask you for the reference one. That's the straight line one. And then it's going to ask you for the definition one. That's the other one over here. And so now if you look over here, if I start to move this thing down, it kind of scrolls along here and it actually moves down. And it actually tells me then how this thing changes as I do that. But basically that's what's going to happen is just going to kind of move this thing along here. And then notice how the value is getting bigger. So for this first 50%, it's 1. When it gets to this point, now my Y value starts to get larger. And that's going to go through and be what the computer is using to vary the size, that Y value. So I've got my law created just by picking those 2. Now, I have to go back then once the law has been created. And I would go through and edit my multi-section and then come down over here again to my area law. And it's just a matter of going through and picking that law. And so again, I'm going to pick that law over here from the tree. And that's the law that I want to follow. And now if I was to go through and re-preview that, you can see how it goes through and changes the shape now to match the law. Now the law is the driver. So again, if I want to come back over here and make some type of change, okay, not exactly what I want. Maybe I go back to this one curve right here. Again, get myself turned around the way it was originally created. And then maybe I decide, okay, yeah, I don't want this, area to be constant here for the first 50%. So I'm going to get rid of this horizontal constraint, delete that. And I can go through and drag this thing up here. And I'm just going to go through and kind of drag that up. So now my area is going to actually get really large here quickly. And I can't go like that. That'll be too crazy. And that's going to come back down. So now when I come back over here and say, okay, I'm going to exit the app, that'll exit the sketch. And that will then update my multi-section then to match that. So as I go through and change that law, it's going to go through that and change the in-between. Now, for this to work though, the section here at the beginning and the section at the end, I have to match those areas on my graph. If my graph told it to be one value and my section told it to be a different value, then it wouldn't work on here. But that's how you go through and use then a law to vary the area in between. So you can see lots of different options that go with that multi-section on here. But you just really got to go through and have the sketches. You got to make sure you've got the right coupling mode. And then again, to further refine that coupling mode, you can always add additional coupling curves if necessary. And then if you want to have a whole lot of control, again, you can use guides that force it to follow that shape exactly. But the guides have to intersect the sections. You can also go through and use a spine that just goes through and controls kind of the intermediate calculations, what those are held normal to. And of course, you've got the relimitation that would let you go through and make it longer on here. But again, if I was to turn these off, since there's no guide curves or there's no spine here, it wouldn't work on there with that on there. And again, the area law just lets you make that law, which then goes through and kind of determines the in-between section area as you create it. Okay, so that's really all I had as far as the demonstration.